welcome. Thank you all for coming. I'm Bill Brown here at Brookings Mountain West, so on behalf of UNLV and Brookings Mountain West, thank you all. We're looking forward to a very interesting and timely presentation tonight. Before we get started, just some housekeeping. We have a large crowd here tonight, a great crowd. The obligatory, if you could silence your phones and other mechanical instruments. And we are recording this program, and we'll put it up on our website. So when you ask questions, we have microphones in the room, but if you could speak loudly, not just for the people in the room, but so we can catch your questions. A commercial for our next lecture, before I introduce our speaker tonight, on April 7th, which is a Thursday. If you've been following our lecture schedule, that's a slight change from, it had been listed as the 5th for a while. But it's April 7th when we'll have Darrell West, who's the vice president at the Brookings Institution and director of their governance studies program, who's going to talk on the internet in the era of spam, cyberbullying, and WikiLeaks. So another very timely presentation that we all come to with our own personal and professional interests. But tonight we're extremely pleased to have another Brookings colleague here, Peter Singer, who is a senior fellow at Brookings. And I hope he won't mind me mentioning the youngest senior fellow in the history of Brookings. He wouldn't mention that, so I will. He's also director of the 21st Century Defense Initiative at Brookings, and I'll let him say more about that in a minute. But Peter is an expert who you no doubt have seen, read, or heard. His writings I commend to you, particularly his recent book, which is also the title of his lecture tonight, Wired for War, The Robotics Revolution and Conflict in the 21st Century. Peter?
Part of this partnership between Brookings and UNLV. I wanted to thank the organizers and also all of you for coming out. What I thought I would do is actually begin a little bit differently than how people begin speeches. And for this is actually, I'm going to tell you a story. And for this story, you have to imagine yourself in Iraq. And you're going down a road, and ahead of you on that road is what looks like a piece of trash. But that insurgent has hidden that IED, that improvised explosive device, with great care. Now, by 2006, there were more than 2,500 of these roadside bombings every single month in Iraq. And they were the leading cause of casualties both among American troops as well as among Iraqi civilians. Now, in this story, the team that's hunting for this IED is called an EOD team, Explosive Ordnance Disposal. They're the pointy end of the spear in the effort to stop roadside bombings. If you've seen the movie Hurt Locker, it's about one of the early experiences of one of these EOD teams in Iraq. Now, in a typical tour in Iraq, and it's actually much the same in Afghanistan today, a EOD team will go out on just about 600 bomb calls. That is, they'll be asked to defuse about 2 bombs every single day. The number, though, that may be the better indicator of these teams' value to the war effort is the fact that the insurgents put a reported $50,000 bounty on the head of a single EOD trooper. Kill one of these soldiers, get $50,000. Unfortunately, this particular story doesn't end well. And by the time that the trooper got close enough to the device to see that it wasn't a piece of trash, by the telltale wires coming out from it, that it was a bomb, it exploded. Now, depending on how much explosives is packed into one of these devices, you have to be a football field's distance or more away from it to escape injury or death from the fragments coming at you at bullet speed. In fact, even if you're not hit by those fragments, just the sheer force of the explosion itself is powerful enough to break your limbs. The soldier, though, had been right on top of that bomb when it exploded. And so when the dust settled and the smoke cleared, the rest of their team advanced, and they found little left of them. And so that night, the commander of the unit did their sad duty, and they sat down to write a condolence letter back to the United States. And in the letter, they apologized for not being able to bring that soldier home. They talked about how tough the loss had been on the rest of the unit, that they felt like they'd lost their bravest companion. But then the commander of the unit did his sad duty, did the last part of the letter that he wrote, tried to write up the silver lining that might be taken away from this tragedy. And this is what he wrote, quote, "But at least when a robot dies, you don't have to write a letter to its mother." That story is actually the true story of the very first robot to be killed in action. That is, the trooper was a 42-pound robot called a PackBot. The destination of the condolence letter wasn't to some farmhouse in Iowa like in the old war movies. It was actually to a factory building just outside Burlington, Massachusetts, that on the side of it says, "I, Robot." It's a real-world company named after the fictional Isaac Asimov novels and the not-so-great Will Smith movie, in which robots start out doing our daily chores. And actually, iRobot, this same company, makes the Roomba, the little robot vacuum cleaner that a lot of people have or you can buy at Sharper Image. So in both the fiction and now the reality, robots have gone from doing our chores to becoming involved in life and death decisions. Now, I'm not one for PowerPoint, and actually one of the first things I did in my program at Brookings was ban PowerPoint from the presentations. But in the front here, we've got a number of folks serving in the US military, and I can see some others. And if you've ever dealt with military folks, they get really itchy if they can't see a PowerPoint program. It's a little bit, enough people get that inside joke. Okay, what's gonna happen different from maybe usual lectures is what's going to play behind us is, if the technology works for us, a series of pictures and images of robotic systems in action in Iraq and Afghanistan. Nothing that you're going to see here is science fiction. It's to show you the reality of this technology that we're talking about. It's either technology already in action in Iraq and Afghanistan or already at the prototype stage. And different from maybe usual lectures is I'm not going to speak to the pictures. They're just going to keep playing behind me, giving you some visuals of what we're talking about here. Now, to pull back on all of this, the book that I did, Wired for War, is about how there's a huge change going on in technology, war, but maybe even the history of humanity itself. The US military that went into Iraq in 2003 had a handful of drones supporting it. Remotely piloted vehicles, unmanned aerial systems, whatever terminology we want to use to describe them, we had a handful in 2003. We now have over 7,000 in the US military inventory. The invasion force that went in on the ground utilized 0 unmanned ground vehicles like that PackBot. We now have over 12,000 in the US military inventory. Last year, the US Air Force trained more unmanned systems operators than it trained manned fighter plane and manned bomber plane pilots combined. So there's some meta changes that are happening right now. But what's interesting is that when we're talking about these PackBots, when we're talking about the Predator, we're talking about actually the Model T Fords, the Wright Brothers Flyer. We're talking about the very first generation of all of this. Indeed, even the terminology that we use sort of encapsulates that. For automobiles, we called them the horseless carriage. For robotics, we call them unmanned systems. That is, we're only able to wrap our heads around what they're not rather than what they are. But that's where we're at right now. Peering forward, one US Air Force 3-star general that I interviewed said, look, we're using thousands now, but very soon it will be, quote, tens of thousands. And what's interesting is it won't be tens and thousands of that system, or even the prototype systems that you'll soon see in the pictures coming. Because there's a law in technology that they call Moore's Law. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's the idea that we've been able to pack more and more computing power into our microchips, into our computers, into our robots, such that they double in their power and capacity just about every 18 months. Now, there's a better illustration I can give of Moore's Law. It's a question to all of you. Have you ever had one of those Hallmark greeting cards given to you, say, for Christmas or Valentine's Day, that you open it up and it plays a little song? Just raise your hand if you've ever held one of those in your hand. Okay, everybody. If you've ever held one of those cards in your hands, you've held more computing power than the entire US Air Force had in 1960 in that one single card. That's Moore's Law, doubling upon itself year after year after year. Now, what's interesting is where that soon takes us. If Moore's law holds true, within 25 years, our computers, our robots, will be 1 billion times more powerful than today. And I don't mean 1 billion in kind of the amorphous way that, folks in Washington like me, when talking about budgets, use 1 billion, 1 billion here, 1 billion there. I mean, literally multiply the power of these systems with a 1 and 9 zeros behind it. Now, Moore's law doesn't have to hold true. It's not like a law of physics. So what if, for example, technology moves at a pace that's just 1/1000th as it has historically? Well, that means our computers, our robots within 25 years will be a mere 1,000,000 times more powerful than today. The point that I'm making is that the kind of things that we used to only talk about in science fiction conventions like Comic-Con are becoming something serious that serious people in places like the Pentagon are dealing with. What is it like to live through a robot's revolution? Now, this is a point where I have to be very clear, in particular when I visit folks in California. I have to be clear, I'm not warning you about a robot's revolution in terms of the Governator and the rise of the machines, and that's what we got to get ready for. What I'm talking about is that in history, every so often there's technologies that come along that are revolutionary. They change the rules of the game. These technologies are very rare in history. They're things like the printing press or gunpowder, or the steam engine, or the airplane, or the computer, or the atomic bomb. And what's key about these revolutionary technologies is not just the capabilities they offer, but the hard questions they force you to ask yourselves. That is, they're not a silver bullet. They don't solve all your problems. Instead, they force questions about what's possible that you never imagined was possible before, but also questions about what's proper, issues of right and wrong that you never imagined you'd have to deal with before. And it's interesting, when I went around interviewing people about what they thought were the parallels today where we stand with robotics to other historic examples, the answers that they would give. A lot of the scientists make that comparison to the horseless carriage, like I mentioned, back around 1909, 1910. And what's interesting is that year, Ford Motor Company sold 250 Model T Fords. But spurred on by the demands of war, within a decade it was selling 1 million of these horseless carriages, and we soon called them automobiles. But why was the automobile revolutionary? Why does it matter in history? Is it because most of us have garages rather than stables? No, it's the ripple effects beyond it on society, on war. It's the mechanization of society in war. It's changes in all sorts of different areas. In geoeconomics, so for example, at the time the automobile comes into fruition, there's a group of desert nomads who are lucky enough to live over a resource that becomes valuable because of this new invention. And they move into a very dominant position in geoeconomics right now. The technology changes our climate itself, global climate change. The technology changes the American city. There's no such thing as suburbia before the horseless carriage. It has social changes. There's no such thing as dating before the automobile. These horseless carriages gave teenagers freedom to engage in courtship in an entirely new way. They weren't limited to their parents' front porch anymore. What's interesting is these technologies also created tough legal questions that required you to have an understanding of the technology itself. So for example, the very first traffic laws entailed that someone was supposed to walk in front of a horseless carriage with a flag to warn people that they were coming. And when they got to an intersection, they would fire a flare off into the sky to let everyone know that they were about to turn. That law made perfect sense when the world moved about 4 or 5 miles per hour. It's absurd in the new world created by this technology. A different parallel is one that Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, gave. And unsurprisingly, he made the comparison to computers. That he said, where we stand with robotics right now is where we stood with the computer back in 1980. Now, if you remember the computer back in 1980, it was this big, bulky device. It could do a limited set of functions. And the main spender on the research and development of computers, and one of the main clients in the marketplace for computers, was the military. But very soon, computers advanced, and most importantly, we found all sorts of new functions for them. And we get to the point that we stop calling them computers anymore. So for example, I drove here in a car that has over 100 computers in it. None of us call these computerized cars. I have a computer in my kitchen, call it a microwave oven. And we're seeing the same phenomena play out with robotics, even in the field of automobiles. So for example, the new Ford models, Lexus, Mercedes-Benz, and Volvos all now have the capacity to parallel park themselves, and they also have what's called crash avoidance technology, which is basically a nice way of saying we stupid humans are not good at parallel parking, and we often don't look in our blind spot, so we let the robotic car take over those jobs for us. But again, why is this thing, the computer, important in history? Is it important because none of us have to memorize long division tables anymore? It's important because of the changes in everything from our economy. Literally billions of dollars can be made in a nanosecond. Billions of dollars can be lost in a nanosecond because of computers. It creates new social relationships. I can be friends with someone in China that I've never met before because of computers. I may be concerned, though, about my niece becoming friends with someone that she's never met before. It, of course, leads to issues of crime or even war. We can have cyber warfare in a place, in a domain, that literally didn't exist before this thing called the computer. The last parallel is one that a number of the scientists were worried about, and it was to the atomic bomb. And the point that they would make is that back in the 1940s, if you wanted to work on what was cutting edge in science, if you were a young graduate student or a professor, you were drawn towards the field of nuclear physics. That's where the most exciting things were happening. Much like today, if you're an engineer, you're drawn towards robotics, or you're drawn towards AI if you're in the computer science field. It's where it's at. It's exciting stuff. But they're worried that a lot like what happened back in the 1940s, that it may be like a genie that we can't put back in the bottle. The point that I'm making here is that usually when people talk about technology, they talk about the nuts and bolts of how the technology works. But what history cares about is all of these ripple effects that come out of it. Those are the game changers. And I'm someone who's interested in particularly the war side of this. And so a couple years ago, I set out on a journey basically to interview anyone and everyone connected to the field of robotics and war. So everything from interviews with the scientists who build these systems, to the science fiction authors who actually consult the Pentagon on what we should build, to folks across the spectrum within the military. Everything from what it's like to be a young 19-year-old operator of a robotic system, to a squadron commander out at Creech Air Force Base, to the 4-star generals in charge of the operations, to the politicians, to the opposite side. What do insurgents in Iraq think about our robots? What do they think about you and me sending robots out to fight them? What about the war of ideas? How are journalists covering the story of robots in war, not just in America, but journalists in places like the Middle East or in Pakistan? And then finally, the right and wrong of all this. So interviews with, for example, military JAG officers, military lawyers, but also interviews with human rights activists. And what I'd like to do in the remainder of my time is sort of walk through what I think were the most interesting, so to speak, stories, ripple effects coming out of all of these different discussions. Now, the first one of these actually relates to something that you already saw, which is that while we're experiencing a robotics revolution, it's not just an American revolution. There's a rule in both technology and war. There's no such thing as a permanent first mover advantage. So, quick show of hands. How many people in this room ever used a Commodore computer? Okay, now for the current students. How many of you use Commodore computers? How many of you have heard of Commodore computers? Same phenomena happens in war. The British, for example, invented the tank. Technically, they invented the land ironclad. They got the idea from an H.G. Wells short story. They rename it the tank as part of a way of keeping it secret from the Germans in World War I. They may have invented the tank, and actually they come out of World War I with about 12,000 tanks. Interesting number, almost the same exact number of unmanned ground vehicles that we have today. But if you know your history, they may have invented it, they may have had the most of them, but by the time World War II rolls around, the Germans have figured out how to use the tank better. And so the challenge for us is that we're definitely ahead of military robotics right now, and we should be. We spend by far the most money on it. But there are 44 other nations in the world that are building, buying, and using military robotics. And they range from nations like Great Britain, France, Israel, Pakistan, Iran, China, Russia, you name it. And this broader use, I think, raises connections in a lot of different areas. One, which I understand a lot of folks here are interested in, is cybersecurity. Whether you're talking about robotic cars, or smart homes, or robotic weapon systems, this takes on a whole new nature when you're talking about cybersecurity. And what's interesting about cybersecurity is it also illustrates the challenge that bureaucracies have dealing with technologic change. So for example, the FBI believes that cybersecurity is the third most important national security issue for the United States, behind WMD and terrorism. The director of the FBI did not have a computer or use email until 2001. That's pretty late in the game. So bureaucracies have a tough time catching up to this. Now, for me, what's interesting in the connection to robotics is a couple of things. The first is, if this is a field that's parallel to the automobile, to computers, to the atomic bomb, then we're going to see an interesting cross between intelligence, that is in the spy game, and intellectual property rights issues. I'll give you 3 examples of this. The first was a set of salesmen for a military robotics company went to a weapons trade show in Singapore. While they were there, there was a booth that they visited where the Malaysian military was showing off one of its military robots. And they noticed it was theirs, or so they thought. And they call back to the headquarters and they say, hold it, we don't think we've ever sold to the Malaysians, have we? They hadn't. The Malaysians were using a knockoff, a cloned robot, so to speak. The second is Lockheed Martin, one of the major defense manufacturers, right now has over 5 different cyber warfare campaigns targeting it. Basically, campaigns are not just one hacker, it's a sort of regularized operation aimed at stealing information. Their Joint Strike Fighter program, which may be the last manned fighter jet, lost over about 1.7 terabytes worth of data from cyber issues. To put that in context, that's as much information that was on the entire internet in 1998 that was lost. The third example is one that you may have seen in the news last year, where insurgents were watching, they had tapped into, they had hacked into, so to speak, the same video feed that our aerial systems were using in certain cases in Iraq. Now, in all of these issues, we're often our own worst enemies. So this case of insurgents watching our own military surveillance feed came about because of 3 issues. One was the unexpected growth of this technology, that we weren't planning on going from 0 to 7,000. And so basically the network of communications that surrounded it was patchwork. The second is the fast pace of the technology. We actually knew about some of the gaps in security dating back to 1999. But to pull off tapping into this video feed back in 1999 was a very sophisticated operation that required a large system to pull it off. By the year 2009, the insurgents were doing it with a packet of $29 software that they got off a Russian website that was originally designed by college kids to illegally download movies from the internet. So something that was highly advanced in '99 was something that college kids were doing in 2009. The last aspect is arrogance. One of the Air Force officers involved said, look, we knew about the vulnerability, but, quote, we didn't think anyone in the Middle East would be able to figure it out. Now, this issue of what I mentioned is actually a lot like some of the other aspects of cybersecurity. It's not the visions that people have of an electronic Pearl Harbor. Actually, what they were doing was the equivalent of someone listening in to a police radio scanner. They weren't able to control these systems. They were just gathering information that, at the end of the day, wasn't a lot of overly sensitive information, but a lot like that thief listening in on the police radio scanner could have been useful. But the point that I'm making here is the more and more that we utilize these systems, and as cybersecurity advances, and as they grow more and more autonomous, you get into an era of also battles of persuasion. That is, where your goal may not be to listen in on the communications, but actually take over the communications in some way, to persuade the system to do things that it wouldn't otherwise, in a way that you can't persuade a human pilot to do so. But there's something broader, maybe, that we should think about in a different direction in this discussion, which is where do you see this within sort of the global framework of competitiveness? Where do you think about the state of America's manufacturing economy? Do you think it's getting better? Do you think it's flattening? Or do you think our manufacturing economy may be getting worse? What do you think about science and mathematics in our education system? Do you think we're getting better in those fields? Do you think we're flattening? Or do you think we're getting worse? However you answer those questions may point to where we end up in this field. Or maybe a different way of saying this is, what does it mean to be sending out more and more soldiers whose hardware actually says made in China on the back of it, and whose software is increasingly being written by someone sitting in India? What does that mean from a global competitiveness standpoint in economics, but also in a security sense? But we shouldn't just think about this in terms of nations competing, because one of the things that's happening is that just like software went open source, the same thing is happening in warfare. This technology, a lot of it is civilian in nature, off the shelf. Some of it's even do-it-yourself technology. You might have seen that video previously of the Raven. It's the hand-tossed drone that the soldier sort of threw like a javelin and it flew away. It's one of the most widely used systems by our soldiers in Afghanistan today. The editor of Wired magazine built his own version of the Raven for $1,000. And so just like what happened in the software industry, the big boys aren't able to dominate. That is, there's other players out there that can access what used to be pretty limited technology. And I think this illustrates, again, this ever-widening access can work out in lots of different directions. One of my favorite stories in the book is about a group of college kids at Swarthmore, a school in Pennsylvania, who wanted to do something about the genocide in Darfur. So they held a Battle of the Bands fundraiser. They ended up raising about $1 million, whereupon they did what any other college kids would do with $1 million in their pocket. They entered into negotiations with a private military company for the rental of drones to deploy to Sudan. One of the students talked about how he changed the voicemail message on his dorm room, because when you're negotiating with mercenaries, the voicemail of, hey dude, leave a message at the beep, just didn't sound professional enough. It wasn't the image they wanted to have in the negotiations. That's sort of a positive story of people wanting to use the technology to stop a genocide. But there's other examples. So a couple years ago, there was a war between Israel and Hezbollah, an organization that a lot of people view as a terrorist group. In that war, both sides flew unmanned aerial systems against each other. And so the point that I'm making here is that we see these trend lines again playing out of what it means to have non-state actors also using this technology. And I think a couple more examples illustrate the changes that that has. One is in terms of the empowerment of individuals and small groups compared to the state. The other is the impact on terrorism in terms of changing some of the nature of suicide terrorism. When I was doing an interview with a scientist from DARPA, he said, essentially, if someone gave him $50,000 and he wanted to, he could shut Manhattan down right now using his current technology and not have to be suicidal. So it's a difference from the aspect of, what an Al-Qaeda 2.0 or what a next generation version of a Timothy McVeigh might be able to pull off. Similarly, is the example of what a 77-year-old blind man was able to do a couple years ago. Now, back in World War II, the United States didn't have to think about air defense against Hitler's Air Force, the Luftwaffe. Hitler's Air Force could not reach across the Atlantic. A couple years ago, a 77-year-old blind man built his own unmanned aerial system that flew itself across the Atlantic. So he had greater power and reach than Hitler's entire Air Force did. And again, one person's hobby is another person's plot. But the ripple effects of this go out in a lot of other directions. I think it's starting to play out on our politics. There's certain trends that are happening in our democracy right now that connect to the relationship of the public to its wars. We don't have a draft anymore. We don't declare war anymore. The last time we actually declared war was 1941 against Hungary, the last of the Axis powers. We don't buy war bonds anymore or pay war taxes anymore. And now we have a technology that allows us to carry out acts of war without having to concern ourselves with the political consequences of that condolence letter going to someone's mother. That is, what I'm saying is the barriers to war, they were already lowering in our society. And now we have a technology that maybe takes those barriers to the ground. I don't think this is one of these political philosophy issues. I think this is a thing that's playing out right now in the Pakistan war. Now, Pakistan war, what do I mean? We have the Iraq war, we have the Afghanistan war, maybe we've got the Libya war right now, I don't know what we're calling it, but Pakistan, what do you mean? Well, actually, when you do it by the number of targets struck, we've hit more targets in Pakistan using unmanned systems than we did in the Kosovo war, and actually now in the Libya war. We just didn't do it all at once. We also didn't do it using US Air Force assets. We're engaging in something that we would have previously called a war by the number of targets hit, but for some reason we don't look at it as a war. And that goes into everything from Congress's relationship with it, where Congress hasn't had a vote on this operation, hasn't actually had a hearing on this operation, to the way the media reports it. We don't report in the same way the Pakistan strikes that we do in these other operations. It goes to who's carrying it out. An air war where we've hit over 200 targets is not led by a US Air Force general. It's led by a civilian intelligence agency at the top of which is a retired congressman from California. The people who are making the decisions about rules of engagement within this campaign are not military JAG officers. They're civilian general counsels. Notice I didn't say whether I'm for or against this or that these are good or bad people. I'm just saying it's changed. What we used to conceive of as a war, we're not right now for some reason. And I think it's because of the technology. But it's not just changing what it means for a nation to go to war, it's changing for individuals as well. For the last 5,000 years, there was a truth of the experience of going to war. And it was the same whether you were talking about the ancient Greeks going to war against Troy or my grandfather going to war in the Pacific after Pearl Harbor. When you went to war, you went to a place of such danger that you might never see your family again. That was an enduring truth of war until today. And this is what a colonel out at Creech said to me about his experience of going to war. He said, quote, "You're going to war for 12 hours. You're hitting targets, you're killing enemy combatants. And then you get back in the car and you drive home. and 20 minutes later, you're at the dinner table talking to your kid about their schoolwork. This is a fundamentally different experience of going to war than what we've seen before. And what's interesting is that it's not playing out in the way that you sometimes hear it reported of people treating it like a video game. Actually, no, these people who are fighting war, but in a different sort of way than before, are taking it very seriously, and in a certain way, maybe almost, you could say, taking it too much to heart, because we're seeing issues of combat stress and fatigue that are hitting these units that are physically 7,000 miles away from the battle space, but are in this other way intimately in the battle space. And certain studies have found actual levels of combat stress and fatigue on the same, in some cases even higher, than for units physically in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's a different kind of challenge. Another aspect of this is not just kind of the experience of going to war, but the demographics of going to war. Who can do what? One of my other favorite stories in the book is about a 19-year-old who was a high school dropout. And he wanted to make his dad proud of him again. So he volunteered to join the US Army. The recruiting officer asked him, what specialty would you like to go into? And he said, I want to be a helicopter mechanic. They looked at his high school transcript and they said, sorry, son, unfortunately, you're not qualified to be a helicopter mechanic under Army rules because you failed your English literature class your senior year. Would you like to be an unmanned aerial systems operator instead? He turned out to be incredible at it. He turned out to be a natural, so to speak. Now, some people say, no, that's not he was natural. It was the fact that he grew up playing video games his entire life. But the point is that he turned out to be so good that after his first deployment, they brought him back, they promoted him to a specialist, which for those of you not in the military, specialist is, it's not an officer, it's not a high rank in the military. And after that promotion, they also gave him a new job. They made him an instructor in the pilot training academy. It's a really cool story from one perspective. Because of this technology, this young man found himself, made his dad proud of him again, serving his nation. I told the story last year at the Air Force Association's National Convention. They did not like this story. You have a teenaged, high school dropout, enlisted man in the Army who's not just a pilot instructor now, but has taken out more enemy targets, saved more American troops' lives than every single F-22 pilot combined. They look at him the way the knights looked at the peasants when the peasants got guns. This issue of demographics, as you saw from some of the other pictures, also is starting to change our own nature, our own bodies. Because one of the things of robotics is they're not just things that sort of walk around outside. We're also starting to put the technology within us. Again, one of the other great stories in the book is about the more than 400 American soldiers who've unfortunately lost arms or legs due to these roadside bombs and had them replaced with robotic arms and legs that are so good now that actually they've gone back to serve in their combat units with a robotic prosthetic. The qualification for proving that you can serve again is equivalent to the Ironman triathlon. The head of the program at DARPA describes it as the Luke Skywalker effect. If you remember your science fiction, in Empire Strikes Back, our hero Luke Skywalker got his hand cut off. And, we, the audience, are like, oh my God, our hero's done for. And then at the very end of the movie, we see Luke flexing a robotic hand. That was science fiction when I was growing up. For more than 400 American soldiers, that's their reality. But of course, we're humans. We don't stop at mere replacement. We're now working on enhancement. So how many people in this room, has anyone in this room had laser eye surgery? Okay, so we're going to ask you what your laser eye surgery delivered. Did your laser eye surgery allow you to see 300 meters at night? That's what a British SAS trooper recently had done for him. That is, it didn't replace what was lost, it gave him the equivalent of a cat's eye vision. Very useful in war, but also where is this taking us? The point that I'm making in ending is that There's always two sides to every revolution. We have Moore's law, but we also always have Murphy's law. You're getting incredible science fiction-like capabilities, but you're also getting incredible science fiction-like questions that you have to figure out. And that's everything from the issues that we talked about of dilemmas that it takes you to just plain old oops moments, which is what a robotics company vice president talked about. When things don't work out with your robot, it's just an oops moment. Well, what do we mean by that? Sometimes oops moments are actually kind of funny. Like there was one time that they were testing a machine gun armed ground robot, and it went, quote, squirrely. It started spinning in a circle and actually pointed its weapon system at the review stand of VIPs there to watch. They were very glad that there were no bullets in the gun at the time. Other times, oops moments, though, are very tragic. Just about 3 years ago in South Africa, during a military training exercise, an automated anti-aircraft cannon was supposed to fire upwards into the sky. But because of what an investigative report described as a software glitch, it leveled and it fired in a circle. It killed 9 soldiers before it ran out of ammunition. It's the real-world version of the famous scene from RoboCop. Now, the point isn't that these oops moments just happened, it's how do we respond to them? Imagine if you were the young officer assigned to that incident in South Africa. What system of law would you turn to for guidance? How would you figure out who to hold responsible? Because the challenge is, particularly in war, our laws move at a glacial pace where the technology moves at this exponential pace. So in war, the prevailing laws of war are the Geneva Conventions. They date to a year where the most important technological invention, the year the Geneva Conventions came out, was the 45 RPM record player. So it's a lot to ask of them to keep up with this new technology. And so where I want to close is the fact that it sounds like I've been talking about the future, right? But notice how every single example I gave you, every single picture you saw, wasn't from the future. And so it raises a tough question for all of us, which is, are we going to let the fact that this all looks like science fiction, feels like science fiction, keep us from wrestling with the reality of this technology and the reality of the challenges of it today? That is, we kind of chuckled at the idea of a couple generations before us, people walking in front of their car with a flag. What's a future generation going to chuckle at about us? And so the ending point actually for me is I actually want to jump into science fiction and maybe step above all of this. A couple years ago, the AFI, the American Film Institute, did a survey of its members about who they thought were the top 100 heroes of Hollywood history and the top 100 villains of Hollywood history. And out of every single character in every single Hollywood movie ever made, only one made it onto both top 100 hero and top 100 villain lists. The Terminator, a robot killing machine. And I think it's interesting because it doesn't just show the duality of the technology itself, it shows the duality of the people behind the technology. That is, the thing that distinguishes us as a species is our creativity. We created fire. We created rockets that took our species to the moon. We created art and literature to express our love. And now we're creating this incredible technology. And for both the scientists, but also for the Battlestar Galactica lovers, we may be actually creating an entirely new species here. But if we're honest about it, we're really just doing this to get better at killing one another. And so the question is really, is it our machines or is it us that's wired for war? Thank you. Thank you. We've got a lot of time for discussion, question, and answer, so please raise your hand and stand up when I call on you, and stand up, and we'll just continue to engage on these issues. Yeah, back there.
Well, my name's Alice. I find it. I found this very disturbing, especially the smaller robots. I mean, there's been science fiction films about very small what very small robotics can do. You briefly touched on what law do you turn to, and I wonder what efforts international or within the United States, what efforts are being made to control the manufacturers of robotics and the robots themselves?
So it's a great question, and we can kind of break it into two parts. The first is you're pointing to the size, shape, and form of these technologies are going in lots of different directions, and one of which is getting either quite large or quite small. So, for example, there's a company in California that is manufacturing both a system that has wings the length of a football field, and it's designed to stay in the air not for hours, but ultimately for months. And it also recently made the news for displaying a system that was the size and shape of a hummingbird. That actually was really cool, except I'd been to an Air Force research lab where I saw a system that could fit on the tip of this pin. A lot of interesting things come out of that. Very powerful tool. You know, you have a terrorist hiding out in a building. Now you'll be able to send a bug with a bug in there and listen in on them. Of course, that same scenario sounds kind of disturbing in a law enforcement framework domestically. And so that connects to the second question you asked about, you know, how are the laws dealing with this? Internationally, there's been efforts among some scientists to organize a little bit along the lines of what the what's called the pugwash movement, which was the people who invented the atomic bomb, like 10 years later went, wow, what did we do? And then started what's now looked at as the arms control movement. There's a group, particularly based out of Great Britain, that's trying to do the same for robotic scientists, but it's very, very small. I mean, it's drop in the bucket compared to the whole. The Red Cross and the UN have been looking at this, but really only at the question of what they call targeted killings. That is the use of these systems in in Pakistan, going after terrorist leaders. The interesting thing is they're actually focusing, they're calling it an issue because of robotics, but it's the tactic, not the technology that they're interested in. That is me targeting killing, whether I'm using a Predator drone or an F-16, the issue's the same. It's you know, what's the legality of it? How do I deal with civilian casualties, et cetera? So they're not engaging with some of these bigger technologic issues that come out of where we're headed and where we already are. Domestically, we've got nada. This is going to get really interesting in a couple years when the FAA opens up the national airspace. It's not an if, it's when they open it up to unmanned systems. The discussions are happening today. Some people think it'll be solved within a year, other people say 3 years, but the point is, when it opens up, you get a wide proliferation of these systems used in a wide proliferation of roles. Everything from law enforcement, so right now we're only using them for border surveillance, and Miami-Dade Police Department has a special license to use them. As one of the manufacturers of these companies that I was meeting with said, look, you know, we're looking forward to this because there's 3,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States, and having an aviation department within them, you know, flying police helicopters, for a lot of them is very expensive. For a substantial portion, they can't afford it. We think they're all going to be customers. From a legal standpoint, that's very interesting, and when I interviewed a federal district court judge, they said, yeah, this is going to be a Supreme Court case one day, because our laws right now for probable cause and search and seizure warrants require, you know, a reason for the policeman to be able to peer over your fence. Well, what happens when the system's always above? But it won't just be law enforcement users. In Japan, for example, over 2,000 of these systems are used for crop dusting. I mean, in Australia, they use them for lifeguarding, not actually rescuing people, but they actually fly drones to help watch out for great white sharks. I mean, the wide variety of these roles are just going to take off, and it's going to be, you know, akin to the computer. All sorts of legal issues will come out of it that will be engaged with. You know, no one back in 1980 said the computer is going to create huge problems of privacy, which we still haven't figured out legally. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, after listening to you talk, I had to kind of remind me of Abraham Lincoln's, one of his favorite quotes in terms of all men can withstand adversity, the real test of a man's character is when you give him power. So we're giving these robots incredible power, so whose character are we testing, I guess? I think you were hitting on that, but I mean, I'm very concerned about that. Just leave it at that, I guess.
Well, it's an interesting issue you raise, and I think we could, you know, what's fascinating is we often want to focus on the governmental side, you know, the greater power, and I did in my speech, you know, what does it mean when you can carry out airstrikes, when a civilian agency can carry out airstrikes, something once limited to the military. But, you know, we're in a university setting. We can also think about this issue of kind of power and responsibility within this realm. And think about the questions that a young graduate student in engineering working on robotics might ask themselves. You know, everything from what attributes would it be ethical to build into my system? What attributes should I not build into my system? You know, for example, how autonomous should it be or the like? Who should I accept research and development funding from? Who would it be unethical to accept research and development funding from? Who should be allowed to buy my system that I build? Who should be prevented from buying it? Or to connect to the last question, one of the things that's interesting about a robot is it's always gathering information about the world around it. Well, who should be able to access that information? How much of it should be shared? These are all questions that a young graduate student in robotics who wanted to be ethical might ask themselves. The problem is, unlike a graduate student in the field of like the study of medicine, they actually don't have an ethical code to turn to. They're sort of at a loss. And what I'm getting at is that the field, like any new field, doesn't have a lot of its own sort of rules and roles and norms set up. And a particular concern is that this field, the issue of robotics, connects so many different things, but in discussions, people find it very difficult to connect across those fields. Another way of putting this is a discussion I had with a professor of robotics, and he said, you know, to have a discussion about ethics requires me to put on the hat of a philosopher, and I don't own that hat, so I'm just not going to engage on it. Well, the problem is he's got to engage on that. And so, you know, this issue that you raise, it's not just a policy one, it goes through the entire chain. Yeah.
The notion that civilian agencies can conduct airstrikes, I guess surprises me. I didn't know we were there. We know we farm out a lot of activities now in warfare. Blackwater is an example, and when they commit a wrong, then we can somehow put them through a judicial system that's supposed to. Do we do the same thing with someone who's conducted a civilian entity is a corporation, I assume? What about when there's a conflict of interest? They want to test a new part and they see an opportunity to do so. Is that all being cleared through our government? I mean, we have to be ultimately accountable for their actions, don't we?
Well, let's break it into two parts there. The first is the civilian role in this space. There's a lot of parallels to the private military industry, which is another thing I did a prior book on. And a particular issue is that, again, our laws aren't set up for the actual status of certain people that we're using in war. And that's true whether you're talking about a contractor for a company like Blackwater, or, interesting enough, some of these more operational roles. So a concern, particularly among the military law community, about the use of civilian operators of these systems out at Langley that are conducting some of the strikes in Pakistan, is what is the status of, what is the legal status of those people? That is, one of them believed that they're in a sort of netherworld, a place that doesn't exist legally, which ironically is sort of our justification for putting people in Guantanamo Bay. The law doesn't deal with you, so we're going to put you in this place that also sort of outside the law as well in terms of, you know, we can go into longer discussion on Gitmo. But the point is there's some concern on that. And the concern goes in two directions. It's the concern about what happens if they do something wrong. Is the legal system set up to deal with that? So, you know, trial by a jury of your peers will, someone who makes a rules of engagement decision that's wrong, a court-martial system is set up to deal with that. Our peers, civilians, are not set up to weigh in on those kind of issues. The second part of it, though, is and I make that Gitmo parallel, it's a concern over how they might be treated if they were captured. And this is something that's really interesting because of the nature of this technology, is that, let's go out of the civilian intelligence realm, let's just go into the Air Force systems. They're flown by people at places like Creech, in uniform, lawful combatants, in the chain of command. But much of the maintenance and weapons loading of them is actually done, of course, in the field where the plane is. Old school thinking, that's behind the battle lines. But the strange thing is that the civilian contractor in a place like Bagram is actually under more danger than the person at Creech. And there's a concern about the status issues of what that means. There's also a concern about what happens, again, a soldier is not bound by a contract. They're bound by an oath. A contract can be broken. If a soldier walks off the job, they're AWOL, they're prosecutable. And so there's also some concerns about what happens if, you know, I don't know, we get in a war with a crazy Asian power that has a nuclear bomb. No one knows what I'm talking about. Or a crazy Middle East power that will probably have a nuclear bomb. The concern among some in the Air Force is that how many of the contractors will show up to work that day? They'll show up to work in the US, but what about your contractors in Bagram or Al Udeid or the like? How much pay does one have to get to keep coming in? Some will definitely do so. They'll be loyal. But you know, what if 10% of your workforce doesn't show up? Well, that matters when, for certain systems, 100% of the workforce in maintenance and weapons loading is civilian contractors. So these issues that we were talking about, they aren't just legal issues. They're actually, you can think of them as military doctrine issues, but they're also kind of philosophical issues too, because what does it mean to have civilians operating in the realm of war? Yeah, over here, I think you had, yeah.
As far as students goes, what can you say for like degree programs? Where do you see this going for students to be studying?
This field, you know, again, I just go to the parallels. So if this field is like computers in 1980, it's going to continue to be a hot field, and there's going to be more and more opportunity in it. To connect to a prior question, I think the programs and the students within them that will thrive are the ones that can cut across different issue areas. And that's not just the ability, for example, you know, in a lot of, I don't know the situation here at UNLV, but in a lot of sciences programs and engineering programs, a student can go through the entire program without ever taking a humanities course or without ever taking, you know, an ethics course or something like that. That's one example that I think, you know, people having other kind of tools, that professor having the ability to put on a philosopher's hat while also working on robotics is going to make a better program, a better student. But it also is even crosses into sort of issues of specialization. So as an example, at Northwestern, they're doing some really incredible work in robotics. One of their leading folks is actually a biologist. The reason is that we're discovering in the design for robotics, evolution actually has done a pretty good job. Evolution has, you know, a couple 100 million years of experience on us when it comes to designing something that's really good at flying or really good at swimming. So as an example, the first Navy undersea bots looked like little torpedoes, little submarines. And then someone realized, well, actually, the fish is more power efficient. You know, its design is more elegant. And so it's actually the biologists that are helping the roboticists. So what I'm getting at is that people who can cross fields will probably be the ones that thrive the most. The same thing in terms of programs that are able to bring in connections, everything from the humanities to, you know, an engineering program that's partnering with a biology program and the like. In the back there, I thought we had some. Yeah.
Yeah. When we're replacing soldiers with robots, and robots are doing the fighting and dying. At what point, you know, does this become an incentive to have perpetual war? It's like, at what point do we say, you know, is there like a limit to like soldier to robot ratio that we're going to be having here? Like, what's the deal with that?
You're asking actually the Star Trek episode question, where.
I haven't seen this.
Okay, well, there's one that almost someone always asks, which is there's one episode in Trek where basically a planet has evolved to they carry out war by. The computer tells them how many people died on each side, and that's it. And Kirk thinks this is horrible and destroys the system and then leaves the planet for war, and then Kirk goes off to romance people. On your question, you know, it's interesting. One, we're not close now to full replacement by any means. And most of the design for these systems is, I think, headed towards what they call warfighters associates programs, where the idea is the teaming of robotics and soldiers, each kind of doing what they do best. The parallel that people make is the role of the quarterback in the football team, that the human may be like the quarterback. And the quarterback's out there. The quarterback calls plays. The wide receivers, the robotics in this instant, carry out the plays. But the wide receivers have enough autonomy that if the situation changes, they can react without the quarterback telling them. Much like the quarterback's about to get sacked, the wide receiver can break the play and come back. That it's going to be that kind of pairing is the most likely future. Full replacement, we're just not near there. But there's another part you said, you know, will we get to a period of perpetual war? Well, maybe we're already there without robotics. I mean, and this is one of the U.S. Army strategic documents describes being in a period of persistent conflict, which is, you know, persistent, perpetual, you know, potato patata. We are in a world where we are constantly engaging in conflict. We may not call it a war, but we're certainly, our military is engaged in it. My bigger concern is the fact that the public's not aware or not engaged in the same way. And what does that mean for the nature of our democracy? You know, what the notion of a citizen is about rights and responsibilities. Well, what does that mean? You know, what does it mean that each year the U.S. Army has to persuade the parents of roughly 70,000 kids to join, to go off and potentially fight and die? Versus on Veterans Day last year, 4.7 million young Americans played the game Modern Warfare 2, the video game that came out. Most of them not aware when they were playing the video version of war that they were doing so on Veterans Day. And their parents, most of them not even thinking about it. That what I'm getting at is more parents' connection to war is through their kids playing video games than the 70,000 parents that are worried about their sons and daughters. That's a weird thing to think about in the nature of our democracy. Let's give someone over the neck.
Are there any statistics on the confirmed deaths from UAVs? Or is it an error-free number?
It's a really interesting question, and it points to one of the things that those of us in think tanks are fascinated by, and actually one of the flaws of think tanks. So where this has become an issue that's particularly focused in is actually, again, in the Pakistan operations. Well, let's pull back on this. The technology, on one hand, gives you a level of precision that we've never seen before in war. The ability to just pick a single target, track that target for hours and hours, get a pattern of life of that target, and drop a single bomb on that target. Compared to, in World War II, we required, I think the ratio was 78 B-17 bomber missions, each carrying roughly 20 bombs to get one bomb on target. So great precision. But just because you have precision doesn't mean that you have what, Donald Rumsfeld thought we would get, which was the fog of war being lifted, to use his quote. This has been a book talk. Don't buy that book. It's a great work of fiction if you're interested. But a good example is in Afghanistan, there was an incident where German troops reported what they thought was a Taliban convoy. We got a Predator over that situation. We had video feed. We had the local German troops saying this is Taliban. Everything seemed right, and they were wrong. It was civilians. What I'm getting at is that the precision doesn't lift that problem set. Now, to the number of civilian casualties in Pakistan, this is a controversial issue because there's a concern whether these targeted killings of leaders is actually creating more civilians being killed and anger around this. The honest answer is no one knows the numbers. Now, what's interesting to me is someone following this field is that the New York Times reported that roughly 3,000 civilian casualties in Pakistan because of the CIA strikes there. Their source was a think tank, not Brookings, but it was a think tank. The source that the think tank, it was a DC-based think tank, that was getting its reporting from was a Pakistani newspaper. If you read the Pakistani newspaper, the source quoted for the 3,000 person figure was a unnamed ISI official, Pakistani intelligence. A couple months later, the Washington Post reported that no, only 30 civilian casualties have happened. If you backtrack similarly, the source on that, it ultimately was an unnamed CIA official. So we have somewhere between 30 and 3,000. And what seems like good analysis, but actually if you deconstruct it, it turns out to just be really, it's a lot of biased stuff. And so my own personal sense is the truth is somewhere in between that 30 and that 3,000, that we're definitely trying to act with precision, but anyone who thinks that mistakes don't happen, that bad things don't happen, is just full of it. And the worry is that your belief in the precision, in particular among civilian policymakers that may not have the experience or the expertise on this, could lead us to do it more often than we should. That is, a JAG officer in the military weighs in with a lot of, there's a lot of thinking behind this, a lot of experience behind this. It's not always the same in a civilian agency that's shaped by politics in a different way. Yeah, right there.
Question. We call them remotely piloted vehicles because we got a human in the loop that pulls the trigger. Where are we at now from a legal perspective on, whether you can have autonomous decision-making as well as trigger pulling?
Well, actually, we call them remotely piloted vehicles really because of a dispute between the Army and the Air Force. They were originally called remotely piloted vehicles back in the 1960s. Then they changed them to unmanned to describe them more. But then you had a recent dispute between the Army and the Air Force over who could operate these systems. The Air Force renames them remotely piloted, which means by definition, in the name, it has to be a pilot, which is important because the Army's operating the very same systems with non-rated pilots. Also important, a pilot is an officer. There's a thing in it. But to your point about we're not yet in fully autonomous with our unmanned aerial systems. There are some ground systems that have autonomy. But what's interesting on the legal framework is actually an experience I had 2 weeks ago. I was at a law conference at which the General Counsel of the U.S. Air Force spoke at. And someone asked pretty much the same question that you did about the legality of autonomous systems. And he said, completely illegal, we would never work on something like that because of the issues of accountability involved. 4 days later, I was at Office of Naval Research, which is where the scientists are at. And they were kind of chuckling about this because they're all working on autonomous weapon systems. And actually the question, and I think we're getting to the witching hour, the question that one of them asked me was, what kind of safeguards should we build into our autonomous weapon systems to keep them from turning on us? And I turned to him and said, everyone thinks that's what you guys are wrestling with, but this is the world we're in. I mean, your question sort of encapsulates the problem where the legal people are saying, we would never ever do this, and it's hard for us to conceive that it's even possible. The scientists are already doing it, but they also are unsure of the implications of what they're doing, where it heads to next. That's not new in human history. I mean, that's always happened, but it's just really troubling. And I think what makes it more troubling is that Moore's Law example again. It's happened in history in the past, but the pace of the technology was such that we could keep up with it. Now the technology is moving so fast that we're kind of falling further and further behind. I think we're getting to the witching hour. Again, thank you all for a really great set of questions.
Thank you all for coming. I always have to apologize for bringing things to a close, but Peter will be here for a little while if you have some unanswered questions. Again, thanks for coming. Hope we see you on the 7th.